The silver ink on the seating card felt like a weight in Hazel Brooks's hand. The noise of the Boston Winter Gala seemed to fade, though the string quartet kept playing, and the ballroom floor remained crowded with wealthy guests. Hazel stared at the elegant card resting against her faded glove, trying to understand how it had happened. Her cousin, Chloe Kingsley, had written a name in the final empty slot for the midnight toast. It was a name that no normal person approached without a direct invitation. It belonged to the most feared figure in the city's hidden elite, Nathaniel Frost, the Vampire King. Hazel did not look up immediately because she could feel the heat of the room and the sharp sting where her old dress had torn along the hem. Around her, the high society of Beacon Hill laughed and moved beneath the chandeliers as if nothing bad could ever happen in the bright light. Chloe stood before her in a dark green dress that cost more than Hazel's entire allowance for the past 3 years. A diamond necklace caught the light at her throat, throwing small patterns across her chin. Beside her, Aunt Miriam held her wineglass with the total calm of a woman who had never known a single day of hardship. Uncle Charles stood a few paces behind them, a polite smile fixed beneath his gray mustache. To anyone else in the room, they looked like a kind family, helping a quiet relative enjoy her first major social event of the season. To Hazel, they looked like a cage that was slowly closing around her. They knew exactly what happened to humans who bothered the pale-skinned rulers of the night without cause. "I put his name down for you," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a soft tone that sounded like kindness to the people standing nearby. "Now you cannot say that we left you sitting alone by the water pitchers all evening, dear cousin." Hazel looked from the card to Chloe's bright eyes. "You should not have done that, Chloe," she whispered. "He does not look for company." Aunt Miriam's fan opened with a quick click. "Do not look so miserable, Hazel. It is only a conversation. A young woman who depends on our household should be glad for any chance to be noticed by the city's elite." Hazel knew what that phrase meant, because it had followed her for 5 years since her father died. Her position in the Kingsley home meant wearing Chloe's old clothes, clearing the table when the servants were busy, and staying quiet during family dinners. It meant copying guest lists until her fingers cramped, and sitting in the corner during parties, while Chloe collected compliments. Tonight, Chloe had chosen her trick well. Nathaniel Frost did not mingle with the human crowd. He only came to these charity galas because ancient treaties required his presence. He spoke to no one longer than courtesy demanded, leaving behind a trail of whispers about his cold nature and his immense wealth. Mothers kept their daughters away from him, and businessmen lowered their voices when his name was spoken in the corporate offices downtown. "You must go over there," Chloe whispered, pointing her finger toward the quiet end of the hall. "The toast will begin in 10 minutes. You would not want to keep the king waiting after your name was sent to his table." Hazel gripped the card more tightly. It had belonged to her mother once, a small silver holder with tiny leaves carved along the side. She had brought it tonight because it was the only beautiful thing she still owned that Uncle Charles had not sold to pay for the family's summer travels. She would not let Chloe see her hide it. "Your sleeve is fraying," Chloe added, looking down at Hazel's wrist. "Perhaps he will find your poverty amusing." Hazel stood still for 3 seconds while the music changed to a slower rhythm. She could walk out of the room, or she could drop the card into the trash. But every escape would become a story her aunt would tell the neighbors tomorrow. She had lived inside their stories for too long, always described as the poor, difficult girl who should be grateful for a roof over her head. Her father had always told her that dignity belonged to the person who refused to run. She had forgotten many things about his voice, but she remembered that single lesson. "Very well," Hazel said, adjusting the front of her gray dress. Chloe blinked, looking disappointed that Hazel had not started to cry. The walk across the ballroom felt longer than it actually was. The crowd seemed to divide in small shifts as Hazel moved past the tables. A gentleman she had met during tea last week looked away quickly, his face tightening with embarrassment for her. Hazel kept her steps steady and slow, refusing to look like she was rushing toward a disaster. The musicians drew out the last notes of the waltz, and the sudden quiet made her movements even more visible to the people watching from the balconies. She understood the plan now. This was not about a dance or a toast. It was about showing everyone that Hazel Brooks did not belong in their world. When she reached the edge of the terrace, the older guests stopped talking. Nathaniel Frost turned his head, his pale eyes fixing on her face without any surprise. He was taller than the human men around him, dressed in a black suit that looked simple but perfect. His white hair caught the reflection of the snow falling outside the glass doors, and his skin was as smooth and white as marble. He looked like a being carved for ancient offices rather than modern parties. He did not move as Hazel approached, but his stillness felt more powerful than any gesture. "Good evening," Hazel said, keeping her voice low. "I believe my family placed your name upon my card." Nathaniel Frost held the silver card between his white fingers, studying the metal as if it were a legal document. He did not look across the crowded room toward Chloe, who was watching from the shadow of a large pillar. He did not look at the older men who had backed away from the terrace table. He kept his eyes on the silver leaves carved into the border, and in that silence, Hazel felt the cold air from the window touch her neck. The musicians were tuning their instruments for the midnight toast. A violin gave one long, thin note that seemed to hang in the air between them. Hazel kept her hands flat against her sides to stop the fabric of her skirt from shaking. The white-haired man looked down at the script on the paper. The ink was fresh and dark, written with a hurried hand that did not match the elegant engraving of the card itself. He noticed the tiny scratch where another name had been rubbed away to make room for his own. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice low and clear enough to travel through the quiet corner. Hazel met his gaze. His eyes were not dark like a human's. They held a faint silver light that seemed to see past her expression. "Did you write this?" he asked. "No," Hazel said honestly. "Did you want me to read it?" "No," she said again. A small murmur passed through the guests standing near the bar. Hazel felt her face turn warm, but she did not drop her head. "I apologize for taking your time," she said, reaching out her hand to take the card back, so she could leave before the family could enjoy the scene any further. Nathaniel did not return the silver holder. His fingers closed over the edge with a gentle but final movement. "You have not taken anything," he said, looking past her shoulder toward the main room. The temperature of his expression changed, turning cold enough to make the air feel like winter. Across the floor, Chloe's smile disappeared. "The midnight toast is a long tradition," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "And I have no other engagements tonight." Hazel could hear the sound of her own breath over the soft music. "There is no need to do this," she whispered. "I know my cousin's intentions." "I do not care about your cousin's intentions," he replied, offering his arm with the formal grace of an older century. "I care about my own." He did not wait for her to agree or argue. He walked with her toward the center of the floor, his movements so smooth that she felt her own steps become easier beside him. The crowd moved back to give them a wide path. No one wanted to get close to the white-haired ruler, and no one wanted to miss what he was doing with the Kingsley family's poor relative. Nathaniel stopped near the main ice sculpture, where the light turned the snow outside into a dark blue wall. He looked down at her mended sleeve again. "Your family seems very eager to see you fail," he murmured, as a servant brought 2 glasses of sparkling water to their table. "They have been waiting for it for 5 years," Hazel said, taking a glass. "Why?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because my father left many debts, and they believe they are paying them by keeping me in their house," Hazel said, choosing her words with care. Nathaniel took a small sip from his glass, his white skin reflecting the silver surface of the water. "People who talk about debts usually owe something themselves," he said. The comment made Hazel stop. She thought about the locked desk in Uncle Charles's office and the legal letters that arrived from the state capitol every month. She had never been allowed to read them, but she had seen the red stamps on the envelopes before they were burned in the fireplace. "You should not ask about my family," Hazel said, looking down at the ice. "It will only cause trouble for you in the city councils." A very faint smile appeared at the corner of Nathaniel's mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "Miss Brooks, the city councils have been trying to cause trouble for me for 100 years. They have not succeeded yet." He set his glass down with a small click that sounded like a key turning in a lock. "Tell me your father's name." "Edward Brooks," she said. Nathaniel's fingers went still against the tabletop, his white hair falling slightly forward as he thought. The midnight bells began to ring from the old church tower across the street. The guests lifted their glasses, their voices rising in a loud cheer that filled the high room. Nathaniel did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on Hazel's face until the final bell stopped ringing. "Your father was not a man who left debts," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise of the celebration. "He was a man who signed a treaty with my house 20 years ago." Hazel stared at him, her fingers slipping against the silver card holder as the truth began to change the shape of her life. The morning sun did not bring any warmth to the high rooms of the Kingsley house on Beacon Hill. Hazel stood by the long sideboard, pouring black coffee into Aunt Miriam's porcelain cups, while the family sat around the breakfast table. No one had spoken to her since they got into the carriage last night. Chloe was staring at her toast, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin until the linen wrinkled. Uncle Charles was holding the morning newspaper, but he had not turned the page for 5 minutes. Hazel could see the small tremor in his hand whenever the silver spoons hit the saucers. "A mistake," Aunt Miriam said, breaking the silence with a sharp voice that did not hide her anger. The man was simply being polite because he did not want a scene at the charity gala. There is no reason to think anything else will come of it. Uncle Charles did not look up from the paper. "He took the card, Miriam. He does not take cards from humans." The front doorbell rang before Aunt Miriam could answer. It was not the light pull of the mail carrier or the quick knock of the grocery boy. It was a loud, steady ring that echoed through the empty hallway. Hazel set the coffee pot down as Harris, the old butler, walked past the dining room door. The house grew so quiet that she could hear the sound of the front lock turning. A moment later, Harris returned with a small silver tray. On it lay a thick white card with a single black letter printed in the center. A Frost. Uncle Charles took the card, his face turning pale against his dark robe. "He is outside," Charles whispered, looking at his wife. "He does not wait for an invitation." Aunt Miriam stood up so fast her chair scraped the hardwood floor. "Hazel, go to your room. Miss Brooks will stay," a voice said from the doorway. Nathaniel Frost stepped into the dining room before Harris could announce him. In the bright morning light, his white hair looked like silver threads, and his skin was so pale that the blue veins showed clearly against his wrists. He was wearing a long dark coat that smelled of the winter air outside. He did not look at the breakfast table or the expensive paintings on the wall. He walked straight to the corner where Hazel stood, his boots making a heavy sound on the carpet. "Good morning," he said to her. "Your Grace," Uncle Charles said, trying to smooth his robe as he stood up. "We did not expect a morning call from your house. My niece is not prepared for visitors." Nathaniel did not turn his head toward Charles. He kept his eyes on Hazel, his silver gaze looking at the dark circles beneath her eyes. "Are you cold?" he asked her. "The house is old," Hazel said, keeping her voice steady. "The fires are small." Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and drew out a length of thick silk ribbon, as silver as his hair. "My mother sent this for your mother's holder," he said. He laid the ribbon on the sideboard beside the coffee pot. It was a simple gift, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. A gift from the Frost house was a sign of protection that no family in Boston could ignore. Chloe made a small sound in her throat, her face turning red with jealousy as she looked at the expensive silk. Aunt Miriam stepped between her daughter and the sideboard, her fingers gripping her fan like a weapon. "We are very grateful for your kindness, Your Grace," Miriam said, her voice shaking. "But Hazel has many duties this morning." "Her duties are finished," Nathaniel said, turning his silver eyes toward Uncle Charles at last. I have come to discuss the agreement signed by Edward Brooks in the winter of the year 2006. Uncle Charles dropped his newspaper onto the floor, the pages spreading across the rug. That agreement was settled when he died, Charles said, his voice dropping into a low, defensive tone. There is nothing left to discuss with this family. The records in my office say otherwise, Nathaniel replied, his white hand resting on the back of a dining chair. And my records do not lie. Hazel looked from Nathaniel to her uncle. She remembered the nights before her father died, when he would sit at his desk with a large leather ledger, counting columns of numbers that never seemed to balance. He had always told her that the money would be safe when he was gone, but Uncle Charles had told her the bank had taken everything within a week of the funeral. What agreement? Hazel asked, stepping forward from the sideboard. Nathaniel looked at her, his face turning gentler for a fraction of a second. A trust, Miss Brooks, one that your uncle has been hiding for 5 years. The small back room where Hazel kept her sewing supplies was cold during the afternoon hours. She sat by the narrow window, the silver ribbon from Nathaniel Frost resting across her lap while she mended the hem of Chloe's blue dress. Outside, the snow was falling again, covering the brick walls of the Beacon Hill alleyways with a thick white coat. Hazel could hear the sound of the family downstairs, their voices rising and falling in an argument that had been going on since the Vampire King left the house at noon. They were afraid, and that fear made the house feel different. Molly, the young kitchen maid, slipped through the door with a small bundle of firewood under her arm. Her face was red from the drafts in the basement, and she looked toward the hallway before she closed the door behind her. Miss Hazel, Molly whispered, setting the wood by the small grate. They are talking about sending you to the countryside. I heard your uncle telling the driver to ready the carriage for a long trip tomorrow morning. Hazel did not drop her needle. Where do they want to send me, Molly? To the old house in Vermont, the girl said. That house has been empty for 3 years, Hazel said, looking down at the blue silk in her lap. There is no heat there. That is why they chose it, Molly said, kneeling to start the fire. Your aunt said the city has too many eyes, now that the Frost family is asking questions. Hazel touched the silver ribbon in her sleeve. She knew Nathaniel was powerful, but she did not want to hide behind his name while her family treated her like a piece of baggage. She needed to know what her father had actually left in that locked desk downstairs. Molly, Hazel said, leaning forward. Does your brother still have the keys to the back study? The maid went still, her hands resting on the iron grate. He does, miss. But if Sir Charles finds out, he will turn us both into the street without our week's pay. He will not find out, Hazel said. He is going to the city club at 4 o'clock to meet his lawyers. My aunt and Chloe are taking tea with the neighbors across the square. The house will be empty for 2 hours. Molly looked at the floor, thinking. The fire caught the dry wood, throwing a small orange light across the narrow room. The large ledger is in the bottom drawer, Molly said softly. The one with the brass corners. I saw him locking it last week after a letter came from the central bank. Hazel stood up, letting Chloe's dress fall into the wicker basket. Get the keys, Molly. I will be downstairs by the back stairs when the carriage leaves for the club. The girl nodded once, her face pale but determined, before she slipped out into the dark passage. At 4 o'clock, the heavy front door clicked shut. Hazel stood in the shadow of the pantry, watching through the small window as Uncle Charles got into the black car that waited by the curb. A few minutes later, Aunt Miriam and Chloe walked across the snow-covered street, their heavy furs protecting them from the wind. The house became perfectly quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when a family's secrets are left alone in the dark. Hazel moved down the carpeted hall toward the back study, her old shoes making no sound against the rugs. The study door was heavy oak, painted a dark blue that looked almost black in the winter shadows. Molly was already there, her fingers shaking as she tried 3 small keys on the brass ring. The third one turned with a heavy click that sounded like a gunshot in the empty house. Hazel pushed the door open, the smell of old paper and stale tobacco smoke hitting her face. The room was small, its walls covered in legal books and old maps of the Boston Harbor. She walked straight to the desk in the center. The bottom drawer was locked with a separate latch, but the brass corners of the ledger were visible through the gap in the wood. Hazel did not use a key. She took the heavy iron letter opener from the desktop and wedged it into the old seam. With one hard pull, the wood splintered with a sharp crack. Inside lay a packet of letters tied with a thick black cord, and beneath them, the leather ledger that her father had kept until the week he died. She opened the first page, her eyes finding her own initials written in her father's neat hand. The dining room at Lady Burnham's townhouse was bright, with 40 candles, when the Kingsley family arrived for dinner the next evening. Aunt Miriam had insisted that Hazel wear her gray dress again, claiming that a simple girl should not try to outshine the daughters of the city's old money. Chloe wore a new cream-colored dress with the diamond necklace her father had given her for her birthday. They walked into the room with their heads high, but the conversation among the guests dropped as soon as Hazel's name was called at the door. The story of the gala had spread. Hazel sat near the foot of the long table, between an older doctor and a young woman who refused to look at her. Nathaniel Frost sat at the head of the table, beside Lady Burnham herself. He looked as cold and remote as he had at the gala, his white hair reflecting the candlelight like frost on a window pane. He did not speak to the women beside him, but his eyes moved down the length of the table until they found Hazel. He gave her a small nod, then returned his gaze to his plate. It was enough to make Aunt Miriam's fork click against her plate. "We were all so surprised by your cousin's good fortune," Lady Burnham said down the table, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "To have the Frost house take such an interest in a quiet young lady is quite rare in Boston these days." Chloe lifted her glass, her face turning pink with a false smile. "My cousin has a very active imagination, Lady Burnham. We are only worried that she might mistake a formal business matter for something more personal." Aunt Miriam nodded in agreement. She has always been an excitable girl. Hazel felt 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She kept her hands in her lap, her fingers pressing against the folded page she had taken from her uncle's ledger yesterday. The paper was hidden inside the lining of her glove, flat against her palm. "There is no imagination in a ledger, Chloe," Hazel said, her voice clear and low. The room went quiet, the sound of silver against china stopping instantly. Uncle Charles cleared his throat, his face turning a dark red under the candlelight. "Hazel, that is enough. Let her speak," Nathaniel Frost said from the end of the table. His voice did not rise, but it had the weight of a stone falling into water. No one moved. Lady Burnham looked from the king to Hazel, her eyes wide with excitement. Chloe set her glass down so hard that the water spilled across the white cloth. "I found a letter in my room this morning," Chloe said, her voice shaking with anger. "A letter that Hazel wrote to His Grace last night, begging him for money and offering to leave our house if he would pay her debts." Chloe drew a folded piece of blue paper from her bag and laid it on the table. "She wants everyone to think she is the victim, but she is only looking for a wealthy protector." The paper passed from hand to hand until it reached Lady Burnham, who read the lines with a small frown. The handwriting looked like Hazel's, with the same long loops and narrow letters she used when copying the invitation lists. It asked for $5,000 and promised to do whatever the Frost house required in return for safety. The older doctor beside Hazel shifted his chair away from her. The whispers began again, sharp and ugly, filling the bright room with the sound of judgment. Hazel looked at the blue paper as it reached the end of the table. She knew she had never written those words, but she also knew how easily Chloe could copy her script after watching her work at the parlor desk for 5 years. She looked down at her own plate, her throat tightening as the trap closed around her name in front of the entire city elite. Nathaniel Frost reached out his white hand and took the letter from Lady Burnham's fingers. He held it up to the candlelight, his silver eyes studying the blue paper for 3 seconds. He did not look angry. He looked entirely bored by the trick. "This paper is from the Kingsley Library," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers. "The watermark is the Kingsley crest. Miss Brooks does not have access to the library desk. She writes her letters on the coarse gray paper from the kitchen storeroom. I have 3 of her father's letters in my office, and the script does not match this modern ink. The carriage was waiting by the iron gates when the dinner ended at 10 o'clock. The snow was coming down in thick sheets now, blurring the lights of the cars along Commonwealth Avenue. Uncle Charles gripped Hazel's arm as they walked down the stone steps, his fingers digging into her gray wool sleeve until she winced. "You will be in Vermont before the sun comes up," he hissed into her ear, his breath smelling of the brandy he had taken after Nathaniel Frost spoke. "We will tell the city you have gone to care for a sick relative." "She will not be going to Vermont," a voice said from the white darkness. Nathaniel Frost stood beside the carriage door, his white hair covered in a light layer of snow. He looked like part of the winter storm itself, his pale face sharp against the dark wool of his collar. He did not touch Uncle Charles, but his presence made the older man drop his hand from Hazel's arm immediately. Aunt Miriam stepped back into the shelter of the porch, her long fur coat shaking in the wind. "This is a family matter, Your Grace," she called out. "The agreement signed by Edward Brooks makes his daughter a ward of the city trust if her guardians fail to provide for her," Nathaniel said, stepping between Hazel and the car. "And stealing $300,000 from a dead man's estate is a failure by any legal standard." Uncle Charles took a step back, his boots slipping on the icy pavement. "That money was used for her maintenance," he shouted over the wind. "The banks approved every withdrawal we made over the past 5 years." "The banks approved them because you showed them a forged signature," Hazel said, drawing the folded page from her glove. In the dim light of the street lamp, the ink from her father's real ledger showed the exact numbers that Uncle Charles had transferred into Chloe's personal account. Nathaniel took the paper from her fingers, his white skin touching hers for a fraction of a second. It felt as cold as the ice on the trees, but it did not make her run. "This is the record from the blue study," she told her uncle. Chloe began to cry, her face turning white as she looked at the paper in the king's hand. "Papa, tell him she is lying. Tell him she stole those pages from your desk." Charles did not answer his daughter. He looked at the white-haired man, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. He knew what happened to humans who broke financial treaties with the night rulers. The city courts did not handle these matters. They were settled in the gray stone halls near the harbor where the sun never entered. "My mother has prepared a room for Miss Brooks at our winter house in Newton," Nathaniel said, opening the door of his own dark car. "She will stay there until the lawyers from Abernathy and Sons have finished checking the Kingsley bank accounts." Aunt Miriam ran down the steps, her face twisted with fury. "You cannot take her from our house without a court order. We have rights in this city." "You had rights," Nathaniel said, his silver eyes flashing with a sudden light that made the horses on the next carriage rear back in fear. "Until you put my name on that card." Hazel looked back at the house on Beacon Hill, its windows bright with the lights they had turned on for the evening. For 5 years, she had believed that she belonged in the dark corners of those rooms, waiting for scraps from a family that claimed to be her protectors. Now, the snow was covering her old tracks on the steps, erasing the path she had taken since her father died. She did not look at Chloe's tears or her aunt's angry face. She turned toward the dark car and stepped inside, leaving the Kingsley family alone in the winter cold. The house in Newton was different from the narrow brick homes of Beacon Hill. It stood in the middle of a large grove of pine trees, its gray stone walls covered in ivy that had turned white with the frost. Inside, the rooms were high and warm, filled with the smell of wood smoke and old leather books. Lady Augusta Frost sat by the great hearth, her silver hair piled high above a dark velvet dress. She did not look like a creature of the dark. She looked like a queen who had outlived 3 generations of human politicians and found them all slightly amusing. "Sit down, child," Lady Augusta said, gesturing toward a soft chair by the fire. "My son tells me you have a remarkable memory for numbers and a very poor collection of dresses." Hazel sat, letting the heat from the logs warm her hands. For the first time in 5 years, Her sleeves did not feel damp from the drafts. "Your family has been very kind," she said. "We are never kind," the older woman replied, taking a cup of dark tea from the tray. "But we are always exact, and your father was an exact man." Nathaniel entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a large leather case that he laid on the table between them. He had removed his heavy coat, and his white hair looked softer in the firelight. "The lawyers have finished with the first ledger," he said to Hazel. "Your uncle has already agreed to return the house on Beacon Hill to the trust. He will be moving his family to a smaller property near the shipyards before the month ends." Hazel looked at the papers in the case. "And Chloe?" she asked. "Miss Kingsley will be spending the winter learning how to mend her own clothes," Lady Augusta said with a small smile. "The city gala will not be inviting her back next season. High society has a very short memory for families who cannot pay their catering bills." Hazel touched the edge of her father's old ledger, which lay beside the legal documents. The numbers looked different now that they were out of the dark study. They looked like a fence that her father had built to keep her safe from the people who had claimed to love him. "What will happen to the trust now?" Hazel asked, looking up at Nathaniel. He was standing by the mantel, his white skin catching the orange glow from the logs. "It will belong to you when you turn 25 next winter," he said. "Until then, my house will manage the funds according to the Treaty of 2006. Hazel stood up, walking to the long window that looked out over the snow-covered lawn. "I do not want to be a burden to your house, Your Grace." Nathaniel walked over to the window, stopping 2 paces away from her. The proper distance was still there, but it did not feel like a wall anymore. "You have never been a burden, Hazel," he said, using her name for the first time since they left the dinner party. "You have been the only honest person in a room full of people who use words to hide their knives." Hazel looked up at his silver eyes, seeing the reflection of the pine trees outside in the pale light of his gaze. "I am still a human," she whispered. "The treaty did not ask about your blood," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping into a soft tone that sounded like the wind through the pines. "It asked about your dignity, and you have kept that without any help from me." Lady Augusta set her cup down with a clear click that ended the silence in the room. "Now, we must see about getting you some proper clothes for the winter assembly. A girl with $300,000 should not look like she was found in the kitchen pantry." The winter assembly was the final ball of the Boston season, held in the Great Hall near the public gardens, where the ice statues were beginning to melt in the early spring thaw. Hazel walked into the room wearing a simple dress of dark gray silk that Lady Augusta had ordered from the dressmakers in New York. It had no diamonds or lace, but the fabric moved around her steps like water. Her white glove was new, its seams perfect and smooth against her wrist. Beside her, Nathaniel Frost walked with his head high, his white hair drawing the attention of every guest in the hall. The Kingsley family was not there. Their seats had been taken by a young state senator and his wife, who bowed politely to Nathaniel as he passed. Hazel looked toward the corner where the water pitchers stood, remembering the girl who had stood there 3 weeks ago with a torn card in her hand. That girl seemed like someone from an old book she had read a long time ago. She turned to Nathaniel, her fingers resting lightly on his black sleeve. "Will you dance tonight, Your Grace?" she asked him with a small smile. "Only if you are willing to risk the whispers," he replied, his silver eyes turning brighter as he looked down at her face. "The city will say you have taken a dark king for your protector." Hazel lifted her head, looking at the chandeliers that shone like stars above the crowd. "Let them say what they want," she said, her voice steady and clear. "They have been telling stories about me for 5 years, and none of them were true. This time, I would like to choose the ending myself." The music began, a slow, deep melody that filled the high room with the sound of strings and brass. Nathaniel led her onto the open floor, his white hand holding hers with the gentle strength that had stayed beside her since the night of the midnight toast. They moved together through the center of the hall, their steps perfectly matched to the rhythm of the old song. The crowd watched them from the balconies and the tables, but their eyes held no mockery tonight. They held the quiet respect that always belongs to the people who have found their own voice in the dark. As they turned beneath the light of the final chandelier, Hazel looked out at the wide windows, where the first signs of the spring rain were washing the frost from the glass. She thought of her father's long silence in the cemetery, of Molly's quick hands by the fireplace, and of the cold rooms on Beacon Hill where she had learned how to wait without giving up. The future did not look like a dark cave anymore. It looked like a long, bright street that was waiting for her to walk down it in her own shoes. She knew there would be more winters and more stories told by people who did not understand her world, but she also knew that she would never have to sit by the wall again. The silver ribbon in her hair caught the reflection of the morning light that was starting to break through the clouds over the harbor, turning the snow into clear water that ran down toward the sea. She rested her hand more firmly against Nathaniel's shoulder, feeling the steady strength of the night beside her, while the human world began to wake up in the warmth of the new sun.